The war horn screamed across the pass, and Ugak Ironblood put her heels into her horse's flanks and rode straight into the heart of the charge, axe raised, war paint smeared like dried blood across her cheekbones. And somewhere in that thundering wall of orc riders bearing down on the shattered caravan below, she saw him. Reuben Wells was not running. Every other human on that stretch of frozen road had scattered like sparks off a struck flint, diving for the rocks, screaming for the trees. But the broad-shouldered man in the patched wool coat was dragging a wounded carter out from beneath an overturned wagon, hauling with both arms while a bay horse screamed and kicked above them both, and he had not so much as looked up at the 40 riders closing on his back. Ugak's warband roared past her on either side, Gruck Boncleaver's raiders, her own kin by blood and oath, and their axes were already dropping toward the stragglers, toward the old woman crouched behind a barrel, toward the boy weeping in the ditch, and toward the man who still had not let go of the carter's wrists. She had killed men who ran. She had killed men who begged. She had never in 6 years of raiding killed a man who simply refused, out of some stubborn animal decency, to save himself first. And she knew his face. The recognition hit her like a fist to the sternum, so hard she nearly lost her seat in the saddle. 6 months. 6 months since a wounded orc scout had crawled half-dead into a fisherman's shed on the outskirts of a harbor town. Feverish and bleeding from a spear wound no healer of her own kind could have reached in time. And a broad, quiet, work-scarred man had found her there. And instead of running for the town guard, instead of taking the bounty a dead orc would have fetched him, had knelt down and packed the wound with clean linen and given her water from his own flask. She had left before dawn without a word. She had told herself she would never see him again. She had told herself it did not matter. It mattered now, with her axe already swinging down toward the back of his skull. Ugak Ironblood wrenched the reins so hard her horse screamed and reared, and the axe meant for Reuben Wells came down instead across the collarbone of Harag Onefinger, her own sword brother, who had been half a length behind her and closing on the same target with murder plain on his tusked face. Harag went down screaming, and the charge around her fractured into shouting confusion, and Ugak Ironblood did not look back to see what she had done. She threw herself from the saddle, hit the frozen ground rolling, and came up between Reuben Wells and the next rider bearing down on them both, her shield already raised, her warcry tearing out of her throat not as a killing sound but as a warning, a claim, a wall of muscle and iron thrown across a stranger's body because some old wound in her own chest could not bear to see him fall. "Get behind me," she snarled in the common tongue, broken but fierce, and Reuben Wells, still gripping the half-conscious Carter under the arms, stared up at her with eyes gone wide with shock and something that was not, she would realize only later, entirely fear. "You're the one from the shed," he said, as if that were the only thing that mattered in the entire screaming world. "Behind me," she said again, and this time he moved. The next rider came in low and fast, a young raider named Voth who Ugak had trained herself 2 winters past, and she caught his axe on her shield with a shock that rattled up through her shoulder and answered with her own blade across his thigh, not deep enough to kill, deep enough to put him screaming off his horse. Behind her she heard Reuben grunt as he wrestled the carter's weight further behind the shelter of an overturned wagon wheel, heard him shout something about the boy in the ditch, and some part of her mind that was not entirely given over to the killing recognized that he was not thinking of his own skin at all, even now. Gruck Boncleaver's voice cut across the chaos like a saw through green wood. "Ironblood. What treachery is this?" She turned, chest heaving, blood not her own streaked across her forearm, and found the war chief himself reining his black horse around not 30 feet away, his face a mask of fury under the iron circlet that had once belonged by right of combat to her father. "No treachery," Ugak called back, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her chest was shaking. "I claim him." It was the oldest law of her people, older than Gruck's stolen crown, older than the war he was trying to drag every clan on the mountain into. A warrior could claim a life on the field, could take a captive as her own before the killing was finished, and no sword brother could gainsay her without challenging her to single combat for it. It was a law meant for slaves and hostages, not for tenderness, not for a dead of the heart 6 months old, but it was the only shield she had, and she raised it now over Reuben Wells's bent head like a second armor. Gruck's lip curled back from his tusks. Claim him and be done with it then, or I will finish what my riders started, claim or no claim. Touch him and I will put my axe through your other eye, Ugak said, and around her, riders who had followed Gruck into 3 border raids went very still, because everyone on that frozen road remembered exactly how Gruck Bonkleaver had lost the first one, and exactly how convenient it had been for him that the only witness, her father Torger Ironblood, had died of his wounds 3 days after the ambush that took it. For one long, terrible moment, nothing moved but the wind screaming down off the peaks and the wounded groaning in the snow. Then Gruck spat, wheeled his horse and bellowed the retreat, because a caravan half plundered, and a full company still to feed was worth more to him than a duel he was not certain, in front of 40 witnesses, that he could win. But his eyes found Ugak's before he rode, and in them she read a promise that had nothing to do with law or claim, a promise that this was not finished, that Hareg's ruined collarbone and Voth's opened leg were debts that would be collected, and that she had just made herself an enemy of her own blood as surely as if she had run him through. She watched them go, watched the dust and snow settle back over the ruined caravan, and only then did the shaking that had been building in her chest since she recognized his face finally reach her hands. Reuben Wells rose slowly from behind the wagon wheel, the carter groaning but breathing in his arms, and looked at her the way a man looks at a fire that has just saved him from freezing and might, in the next moment, burn his house down around him. "You remembered me," he said. "I remembered," Ugak Ironblood said, and found she had nothing else to say that would not shame her in front of the dead. The caravan that had been bound for the trading post at Windgate lay scattered across half a mile of frozen road, and by the time the light began to fail, Ugak had counted the cost of it plainly enough. 4 dead that she could see, the drivers and 2 guards who had not been fast enough or lucky enough. The carter Reuben had dragged from beneath the wagon had a broken leg and a concussion that made his eyes roll strangely when he tried to speak, but he was alive, propped now against a rock with a blanket someone had salvaged from the wreckage. The weeping boy from the ditch turned out to be the carter's nephew, 12 years old and shaking so hard his teeth clicked, but unhurt. An old woman who had hidden behind the barrel had a gash along her scalp that bled alarmingly but was, Reuben assured her in a calm and steady voice that surprised Ugak more than anything else that day, not so deep as it looked. It was Reuben who organized what was left. He had them build a fire in the lee of the largest overturned wagon, had them strip what canvas and furs remained from the wreck to keep the wounded warm, and all the while he kept glancing at Ugak Ironblood, standing at the edge of the firelight with her axe still in her hand, as though he expected her to either vanish into the dark or turn, that axe on the survivors the moment his back was fully turned. "You are the shipwright," she said at last, when the fire had caught and the old woman's wound had been bound and the boy had stopped shaking quite so badly. She had learned that much of him in the shed 6 months past, in the fevered hours before dawn when he had talked to keep her awake and breathing, told her about his work at the harbor in Saltmere, about hulls and keels and the particular stubbornness of green oak. "I build them mostly, repair them more often, now that the yard's slow." He crouched across the fire from her, close enough that the light caught the plain, weathered lines of his face, the sandy stubble along his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of a life spent with rope and adze and plane, not sword. "I was sent up from Saltmere to settle accounts with the trading post at Windgate, timber contracts. My master thought the pass would be safe enough this early in the season. Your master was wrong. My master is going to hear about that when I get home." He said it dryly, and something in his voice, some thread of dark humor pulled taut against real fear, made the corner of Ugak's mouth twitch despite everything. "If you get home." "If I get home," he agreed and looked at her steadily across the flames. "Why did you do it? Turn on your own like that. I saw your friend go down. That will not be forgiven easily, will it?" "No," Ugak said, "it will not." Then why? She could have told him it was law, the old right of claim, nothing more than a warrior's privilege exercised on a whim. It would have been the safe answer, the answer that cost her nothing. Instead, she found herself looking at his hands, at the careful way he had bound the old woman's wound, at the boy sleeping now with his head against Reuben's knee, though the man himself had not asked for that trust, had simply been the kind of man a frightened child leaned against without thinking twice. Because 6 months ago, you had a knife on your belt and a bounty board in your own town square that would have paid you a season's wages for my head, Ugak said slowly, and you gave me water instead. Reuben was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked and spat. Somewhere out in the dark, wolves or worse were beginning to call to one another across the frozen slopes, drawn by blood and death the way such things always were, and Ugak found her hand tightening on her axe haft even as she kept her eyes on the man across the flames. "I did not do it because I expected anything," he said finally. "I did it because you were dying and I could stop it. That is all it was." "That is all it needs to be," Ugak said, and was surprised to find she meant it. They did not sleep that night, not really. Ugak kept the first watch and Reuben the second, though she noticed he did not sleep so much as lie still with his eyes half open, watching her the way a man watches a storm he is not yet sure has passed. Twice she heard wolves circle close enough that she rose with her axe ready, and twice they retreated from the fire, and from the scent of an orc's blood too fresh in the snow to be worth the risk. By the gray hour before dawn, the wind had shifted, and with it came a smell Ugak knew too well from 6 winters spent in these mountains. The wet, mineral bite of a storm building high above the peaks, the kind that could bury a road and everyone on it before midday. "We cannot stay here," she said, waking Reuben with a hand on his shoulder that he startled from hard enough that she stepped back and let him see her palms empty, no weapon in them. "Storm is coming, a bad one. If we are caught on open road when it breaks, the wounded will die of the cold before the wolves ever reach them. Is there shelter? There is a way station, 2 hours north if the road has not drifted shut already. Stone-built, old, from before the border wars, when our people and yours still traded through this pass instead of raiding it." She looked toward the gray line of peaks, calculating distances the way she had been taught to since she was old enough to hold a spear. "It is our only chance, for all of us." Reuben looked at the carter, still barely conscious, at the old woman and the frightened boy, and then at Ugak Ironblood, streaked in blood that was not entirely her own, an axe in her hand and her own warband somewhere behind them wanting her dead for what she had done. "Then we had better move fast," he said, and there was no fear in it at all, only the plain, steady resolve of a man deciding in the space of a breath to trust her. It took the better part of those 2 hours, and every ounce of strength both of them had to spare. Ugak carried the carter herself, slung across her shoulders in a way that would have broken a lesser man's back, while Reuben half carried, half dragged the old woman with one arm and kept the boy moving with the other, and the wind rose behind them with a howl that seemed almost alive, hungry, personal. Twice Ugak had to stop and physically break adrift with the flat of her axe so they could pass, and once, cresting a shoulder of rock with the storm, now a solid gray wall swallowing the peaks above them, she saw the way station at last, a squat, ancient shape of dark stone huddled against the mountainside like something that had grown there rather than been built, its narrow door half buried already in drifted snow. They reached it with the storm's leading edge already lashing at their backs, and Reuben threw his shoulder against the ancient door until the frozen hinges gave with a shriek. And then they were all inside, and Ugak dragged the door shut behind them and dropped the old iron bar across it just as the full fury of the blizzard hit the mountain outside with a roar that made the boy whimper and press himself against his uncle's side. Inside, the way station was one long, low room of undressed stone, a hearth at either end blackened by centuries of travelers' fires, a scattering of old benches and a stone trough for water fed, Ugak knew from old stories, by a spring that ran beneath the floor and never froze even in the deepest winter. Dust lay thick over everything, and cobwebs, and the particular silence of a place long unused, but the roof was sound and the walls were thick, and for the first time since the war horns had sounded on the road below, Ugak Ironblood let herself breathe. "We will not starve, at least," Reuben said, moving already toward the nearer hearth, breaking apart the remains of an old bench for kindling with quick, practiced hands. "There is deadwood aplenty and a spring for water. If the storm holds us here a week, we will manage." "A week," Ugak repeated, and something in her chest, already raw from the day's violence, tightened at the thought of a week in close stone quarters with this man, this quiet, steady, maddeningly decent human who had looked at her covered in his own kind's blood and had not once flinched away from her. "Longer if it needs to be," Reuben said, striking a spark into the kindling with the flint from his belt pouch, and did not look up to see the way she watched him, or if he did, he said nothing of it, only bent to coax the small flame into something that would hold against the cold now howling outside the stone walls. The storm held the mountain in its teeth for 4 days. In that time, Ugak learned the particular rhythm of the man she had chosen over her own warband. The way he woke before dawn out of some old habit of harbor life, the way he hummed, low and half under his breath, while he worked, some tuneless thing that seemed to come from nowhere and mean nothing except that his hands were busy and his mind was easy. She learned that he was patient with the boy, Emric, teaching him knots from a coil of rope salvaged from the wreck to keep his small hands occupied and his mind off the horror of the road. She learned that he was gentle with the old woman, whose name was Mabel and who turned out, once her scalp wound had closed enough to stop frightening everyone, to have a sharp tongue and a sharper wit that made even Ugak's mouth twitch more than once. She learned that he changed the carter's splint without flinching from the smell of it, that he rationed the little food they had salvaged with scrupulous fairness, giving himself the smallest share without comment, and that when Ugak finally noticed this and pushed her own portion toward him, he had simply pushed it back and said, "You worked harder today than any of us. Eat." She was not used to being told to eat by anyone. She was not used. If she let herself think honestly about it in the long, dark hours of watch, she still kept out of old habit even with the storm sealing every enemy out as surely as it sealed them in, to being looked at the way Reuben Wells looked at her. Not with fear, not with the wary calculation of a man measuring a threat, but with something steadier, something that seemed to see past the axe and the war paint and the 6 years of raiding to whatever remained of the woman underneath. It made her want things she had no business wanting from a human man in a stone-way station, with her own war band hunting her blood. On the second night, with the others asleep near the far hearth, Ugak found Reuben sitting up near the small fire mending a torn strap from the wreckage of his pack, his sleeves pushed up past his forearms, the firelight catching the old white scar of some long-healed injury along his left wrist. She sat across from him without quite meaning to, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and watched his hands work the leather with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. "You are not afraid of me," she said finally, because the question had been sitting in her chest since the road and she was too tired, too raw to hold it any longer. Reuben glanced up, and in the low firelight his eyes were dark and warm and entirely too honest. "I was afraid the first time I saw you, in the shed. I thought you would kill me the moment you woke. I did not. No, you looked at the water like you did not trust it was real, and then you drank it like it was the finest thing anyone had ever given you, and then you looked at me like you were trying to work out why I hadn't run for the guard." He set the mended strap aside. "I have thought about that look more than I probably should have these 6 months." Ugak's breath caught, low and traitorous in her chest. "Have you?" "I have." He was close enough now that she could see the small scar through his eyebrow, the faint laugh lines already forming at the corners of his eyes, though he could not have seen more than 30 summers. I told myself it did not matter, that I would never see you again, and even if I did, what would it matter, a shipwright and an orc raider? But then you were on that road with an axe raised over my head, and instead of feeling my life end, I felt, he stopped, seemed to consider his next words with the same careful weight he gave to a joint in a hull that had to hold against the sea. I felt like something I had already lost was being given back to me. That is a dangerous thing to feel about a woman who has just made an enemy of her own people, Ugak said, though her voice had gone rougher than she intended, and she did not move away from him. I have never claimed to be a wise man, Reuben said, and the corner of his mouth curved, and Ugak found herself leaning the smallest fraction closer before she caught herself and drew back, heart hammering harder than it had in the middle of the charge on the road. You should sleep, she said, too abruptly, and rose, and did not look back to see whether disappointment or relief crossed his face, because she was not certain in that moment which one she wanted to see. On the third day, the storm's fury eased enough that Reuben ventured out to the frozen spring-fed trough behind the way station to break the ice and refill their water skins. And Ugak, restless with 4 days of confinement and the particular ache of wanting a man she had no right to want, followed him out into the biting, knife-bright cold under a sky scoured clean and impossibly blue. The world outside was a wonder of white silence, drifts piled shoulder-high against the stone walls, the peaks above wearing new mantles of snow that caught the low sun and threw it back in blinding sheets. Reuben knelt at the trough, breaking the skin of ice with the butt of his knife, and Ugak stood over him with her arms crossed against the cold, watching the muscles work in his forearms, the steady rhythm of his breath in the thin air, and thought, not for the first time, that there was something in the plain competence of him that undid her more surely than any warrior's boast ever could. You are staring, Reuben said without looking up, and there was a warmth in his voice that told her he did not mind. I am considering whether you will freeze to death before you finish that task, Ugak said, and crouched beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his and did not move away. I have broken ice in worse cold than this, mending hulls in the harbor in the dead of winter. He glanced sideways at her, and the look in his eyes was different now, bolder than it had been by the firelight, as if the wide open sky and the blinding snow had stripped away some of the careful distance he had been keeping. Though I admit the company is better this time. Careful, Ugak said low, or I will begin to think you are flirting with me, shipwright. Would that be so terrible? His hand had gone still on the knife, the ice forgotten, and the space between them had somehow narrowed until she could feel the warmth of his breath fogging in the cold air between their faces. It would be foolish, she said, though her own hand had risen, unbidden, to rest against the rough wool of his sleeve. I am an orc raider hunted by her own kin. You are a shipwright with a life waiting for him in a harbor town that would burn me at the stake if I ever set foot in it. Then it is a very good thing, Reuben said, that we are neither of us in the harbor town. And then his hand came up, slow and deliberate, and cupped the side of her jaw, his thumb brushing along the sharp line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that made something in her chest crack wide open. And Ugak Ironblood, who had never in her life let a man close enough to touch her like that, who had killed men for less presumption on the battlefield, leaned into his palm instead of pulling away. Ugak, he said, her name rough and reverent in his mouth, and it was the first time he had said it since the road, the first time he had said it like it was something precious rather than a title to be feared, and that undid the last of her resistance entirely. She kissed him first. She would remember that always, that it was her hand that fisted in the front of his coat and pulled him in, her mouth that found his amid the cold and the blinding snowlight, fierce and hungry and half a promise, half a plea. And Reuben Wells did not hesitate for even a heartbeat before he kissed her back, one hand sliding to the small of her back, the other still cradling her jaw as though she were something infinitely breakable despite every proof to the contrary. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, the cold forgotten entirely, Ugak found herself laughing, low and disbelieving at the sheer impossibility of it all. "This is madness," she said. "Probably," Reuben agreed, and kissed her again, softer this time, lingering, and neither of them made any move at all to break apart a second time. They stayed 4 more days in the way station after the storm broke, though the road was clear enough by the third to travel by the second morning. Neither of them said aloud why they lingered, though the truth of it sat plain enough between every glance, every brush of hands passing a water skin. Every night Ugak found some reason to sit closer to the fire than strictly necessary, near enough that Reuben's arm would settle, easy and sure, around her shoulders. Mabel, sharp-eyed despite her bandaged scalp, noticed long before either of them said a word of it, and took to humming pointedly whenever the two of them lapsed into one of their long, quiet silences by the hearth, until Ugak threatened, with more affection than menace, to feed her to the wolves if she did not desist. It was on the 5th night, with the carter's leg healing well enough that he could bear weight on it, and the boy Emric teaching himself a 4th knot with Reuben's rope, that Ugak finally told him the truth she had been carrying since long before the charge on the road. They sat apart from the others, near the trough at the way station's rear where the ancient spring still murmured beneath the stone, and Ugak drew from beneath her leather bodice, from a hidden pocket sewn against her ribs, a small iron torque no longer than her thumb, carved with the twisting knotwork of her clan and set with a single dull red stone. "This belonged to my father," she said, turning it in her fingers so the firelight from the nearer hearth caught its worn edges. "Ugak Ironblood, chieftain of the Ashfang clan for 11 years, until Gruk Bonkleaver put a spear through his back during a border skirmish and called it an enemy's kill." Reuben went very still. "You know it was not." "I know it was not, because I found this in Gruk's own tent 3 winters past, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath his bedding, when by every law of our people it should have been buried with my father, or passed to his rightful heir by combat, not stolen and hidden by the man who claimed his crown." Her voice had gone flat, controlled, the way it always went when she spoke of things that still had the power to break her if she let them. "Gruk did not win the chieftainship by the old right. He murdered my father and lied to the clan about how it was done, and he has kept that lie alive for 3 years while he drags every warband on this mountain toward a war he wants only for his own glory. And if the clan elders saw that torque," Reuben said slowly, understanding dawning in his face, "saw where it was found, heard your testimony, Gruk's claim would collapse. The elders would strip him of the circlet, try him under clan law, and the war he has been building toward, the war that would see every border town from Windgate to your own Saltmere burned before the next winter, would die with his authority." Ugak closed her fist around the torque. "It is why I could not simply challenge him on the road that day, though every part of me wanted to put my axe through his skull for what he tried to do to you. A challenge fought and won on a battlefield with only his own loyal riders as witnesses would be called a warrior's grudge, nothing more. This must be brought before the full council at the spring moot, with witnesses who cannot be silenced, or it changes nothing. When is the moot? 3 weeks. At the gathering grounds 2 days north of here, past the second ridge." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her, Reuben Wells saw real fear in Ugak Ironblood's eyes, not fear of Gruk's axe but fear of failure, of carrying her father's truth for 3 years only to have it come to nothing. "Gruk knows I have it. He has known for 3 years that something was missing from his tent, though I do not think he ever suspected me until the road. Now he knows for certain. He will not let me reach that moot alive if he can help it, and every rider still loyal to him will be hunting this pass between here and there." "Then we go together," Reuben said, without a heartbeat's hesitation. "Reuben." She said his name like a warning, like a plea. "This is not your war. You have a home, a trade, people waiting for you in Saltmere who will wonder what became of you. I have already cost you enough. I will not ask you to walk into Gruk Bonecleaver's teeth for a quarrel between orcs." "You are not asking," Reuben said, and reached out to still her hand where it still clenched around the torque, his thumb tracing gently over her white knuckles until her fingers loosened beneath his touch. "I am telling you. I did not drag you and everyone else on that road 2 hours through a blizzard to a stone hut so that I could turn around now and let you walk into an ambush alone. I have watched you carry this alone for 3 years, Ugak. You do not have to carry it alone for 3 more weeks." She looked at him for a long moment, at the plain, unshakable resolve in his weathered face, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day her father died finally, cautiously, begin to loosen. "You are a fool, shipwright," she said, but her voice had gone thick, and when he pulled her into his arms she went willingly, burying her face against the solid warmth of his shoulder, and let herself, for the first time in 3 years, be held. They left the way station on the 6th morning. The storm's aftermath melted enough to travel. The carter and Mabel and young Emric escorted first to a shepherd's holding 2 hours down the southern trail where they could wait out the rest of the winter in safety and send word, when the roads cleared fully, back to Saltmere of what had befallen the Windgate caravan. Mabel had pressed both of Ugak's hands between her own before they parted, an act of trust that made the old woman's eyes go bright and Ugak's throat go tight, and said only, "You take care of our boy, Orc woman. He is a good one, better than most I've known, and I've known plenty." "I intend to," Ugak had answered, and meant it more fiercely than she had meant almost anything in her life. The path north climbed hard and fast into country Ugak knew well from a dozen seasons of raiding and patrol. Narrow game trails threading between black cliffs still hung with ice, the second ridge rising ahead of them like a great gray tooth against a sky the color of hammered pewter. Reuben proved, to Ugak's private and considerable satisfaction, no stranger to hard travel despite his trade. A man who had spent his life hauling timber and rigging along a rough harbor was no soft-handed townsman, and though the altitude and the cold tested him, he never once complained, never once slowed her pace, and twice used the same practical, problem-solving mind that served him at the shipyard to rig rope lines across sections of trail where the ice had made the footing treacherous. It was on the second night of that hard climb, camped in a shallow cave mouth with a small fire built back from the entrance to hide its glow, that Gruk's scouts found them. Ugak heard them first, the particular scrape of a boot against loose scree that no mountain-born orc would have made carelessly, which told her these were Gruk's human-born trackers, mercenaries he had taken into his service for coin rather than clan loyalty. She had Reuben's mouth covered with her palm and her axe in her other hand before the first arrow hissed into the cave mouth, and in the chaos of the ambush that followed, 3 attackers against 2 defenders in a space too cramped for numbers to matter, it was Reuben who proved his worth beyond anything Ugak could have asked of him. He had no sword, no axe, but he had a coil of the same rope he had used to teach young Emric knots, and when the second attacker rushed the cave mouth, Reuben looped it low and fast across the man's ankles and hauled with the same braced, powerful pull he used to draw heavy timber up a slipway, and sent the mercenary crashing headlong into the rocks where Ugak's axe finished what the fall began. When it was over, 2 of the 3 trackers dead and the third fled screaming back down the mountain to report what he had seen, Ugak turned to find Reuben sitting hard against the cave wall, hands shaking now that the danger had passed, staring at the rope still wound around his fists. "I've never killed a man before," he said quietly. Ugak knelt before him and took his shaking hands in her own, steadying them, and did not offer him easy comfort because she respected him too much to lie. "You saved both our lives tonight. That weight does not go away. I will not tell you it does, but you carry it and you keep walking, and one day it becomes a part of you instead of a wound in you. I have carried it since I was 16 summers old. How do you bear it? Some days badly." She pressed his hands between hers, warming them, and met his eyes steadily. "But I have never once regretted the men I killed to keep the people I love breathing. And I do not think you will either, once the shaking stops." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, the shaking did stop, and he turned his hand in hers to lace their fingers together and said, low and rough, "The people I love. Is that what I am to you now?" "You have been that to me since the road, Reuben Wells," Ugak said, and this time it was she who closed the distance between them, and the kiss that followed had none of the tentative wonder of the first. Out by the frozen trough, it was fierce and certain and full of everything neither of them had dared say plainly until now, and when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Reuben pressed his forehead to hers and laughed, low and shaky and full of a relief that had nothing to do with the fight just past. "Good," he said, "because I do not think I could stop loving you now even if I tried." "Then do not try," Ugak said, and kissed him again. They reached the shelter of an old shepherd's stone bothy 2 days later, a squat single-room hut built into the lee of the ridge's northern shoulder, meant as a resting point for the last hard push toward the gathering grounds. It was there, with the moot only a day's climb ahead, and the mountain wind screaming past the shuttered window, that Ugak Ironblood finally let herself want without restraint the man who had chosen her again and again, since the moment she broke from her own charge to save him. She had not planned it, not truly, though perhaps some part of her had known since the road that this was where it was always going to end. It was the way Reuben looked at her in the low firelight, stripped of his heavy coat, his sleeves rolled to the elbow as he mended the last frayed strap of his pack, the same patient, careful attention in his hands that he gave to everything, and the way he glanced up to find her already watching him and did not look away. "Come here," Ugak said low and held out her hand. He came without hesitation, crossing the small space between them, and when he sank down before her, close enough that his knees bracketed hers, she reached up and undid the leather ties at the collar of his shirt with fingers that trembled only slightly, and felt him shiver beneath her touch, felt his breath catch when her palms settled flat against the warm skin of his chest. Ugak. Her name in his mouth was half question, half prayer. "I have wanted you since the shed," she admitted, the words coming rough and unguarded in the firelight, stripped of every wall she usually kept between herself and the world. "I told myself it was foolishness. I told myself an orc raider had no business wanting a human shipwright with gentle hands and a heart too big for his own good. I was wrong to tell myself that. I have wanted you since I watched you drink that water like it was the last kindness anyone would ever show you," Reuben said, and his hands rose to frame her face, thumbs tracing the sharp lines of her jaw with a reverence that made her breath catch in turn. "I have never wanted anything the way I want you, Ugak Ironblood. Not the yard, not the sea, not anything in my whole ordinary life, just you." "There is nothing ordinary about you," she said fiercely, and pulled him down against her, and the rest of the night unfolded slow and warm and searingly tender in the firelight. Two people who had crossed a mountain, and a war in every law of their separate peoples to reach this single small stone room, giving themselves to each other at last with none of the careful distance either of them had kept before. Only the certainty, hard won and absolute, that whatever else the coming day held, they belonged now entirely to one another. They reached the gathering grounds the following afternoon and found them already burning. Ugak smelled the smoke before they crested the final ridge, and the sight that greeted them from the high vantage point stopped her heart cold. The great circle of standing stones that marked the Ashfang clan's ancient moot ground, where every spring the scattered warbens gathered under truce to settle disputes and renew oaths, lay half obscured behind a haze of gray smoke, hide tents burning along the northern edge, and even from this distance she could see the clash of steel and hear, faint on the wind, the sound of warriors fighting. "Gruk," she breathed. "He has struck the moot itself. He means to seize the chieftainship outright before the elders can even hear a challenge, burn every voice that might speak against him." Ugak, Reuben's hand closed hard around her arm. "That is not a fight we can win. Look at the numbers." He was right, and she knew it with the cold, clear calculation of a warrior who had spent her whole life reading a battlefield. Gruk had brought perhaps 60 riders, his most loyal, most brutal veterans, against a moot ground defended by elders too old to fight, and a scattering of warband guards caught utterly unprepared by an attack that broke every law of the sacred truce. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter already half finished. But even as the despair of it settled cold in her chest, Ugak saw something else. At the ground's eastern edge, half a dozen elders and a knot of unarmed clan folk, women and children and the old, had been driven back against the standing stones themselves, trapped between the burning tents and a sheer drop to the river gorge below, with a dozen of Gruk's riders closing in for the kill. "They will die," she said. "All of them, unless someone gives Gruk's riders something else to think about." "Then we give them something else to think about," Reuben said, and there was no fear in his voice at all now, only the same steady, immovable resolve she had first seen on the road when he refused to run. "Reuben, there are 60 of them, and one stone choke point at the top of that switchback trail below us, where no more than 2 riders could pass abreast," Reuben said, already scanning the terrain with the eye of a man who had spent his life reading the stress and strain of timber and rope, of forces and leverage, of how a small thing placed correctly could move a very large thing indeed. "And an overhang above it, Ugak, look, half the ridge is already cracked and hanging from the storm's thaw. If we can bring that down onto the trail at the right moment, understanding hit her like a lightning strike. You want to start an avalanche. I want to buy those people time, and if it costs Gruk half his riders in the process, so much the better." He was already moving, scrambling along the ridge's edge to where a great slab of ice-cracked stone hung precarious over the narrow trail below, exactly the choke point through which any reinforcements from Gruk's main force would have to pass to reach the trapped elders. "I have brought down half-rotted masts under less strain than this with a single well-placed lever. Help me find something to work as a wedge, and we do not need 60 men, Ugak. We need one perfectly placed moment." It took the better part of a frantic quarter-hour, using a splintered branch as a crude lever, and every ounce of strength both of them possessed, wedged into a crack in the stone that Ugak's practiced eye had marked as the fracture point, while below them the sounds of slaughter grew louder and closer to the trapped elders at the cliff's edge. Twice the makeshift lever slipped and nearly cost Reuben his footing on the icy ridge, and twice Ugak hauled him back from the drop by main strength, heart in her throat, until finally, with a groan like the mountain itself crying out, the great slab shifted, cracked, and gave way entirely. The avalanche that followed was not the mountain-swallowing catastrophe of old stories, but it was more than enough. A roaring cascade of snow, ice, and broken stone that thundered down the narrow switchback trail directly into the path of a dozen riders Gruk had just dispatched to reinforce the killing at the cliff's edge, burying the choke point in impassable rubble and scattering the reinforcements in screaming chaos, cutting Gruk's main force in half in the space of 10 heartbeats. "Now!" Ugak shouted, and did not wait for Reuben's answer before she was moving, half sliding, half running down the steep goat track toward the moot ground below, axe already in her hand, her warkri tearing loose from her throat not as the raider's scream she had used for 6 years, but as something older, something that belonged to her father's memory and her father's people, and the truth she had carried 3 years to bring to this ground. She hit the rear of Gruk's remaining force like a thunderbolt, and for one blinding, brutal quarter-hour, Ugak Ironblood fought as she had never fought in her life. Not for raid glory, not for Gruk's approval, not for anything but the lives of the elders trapped against the stones, and the man she loved fighting his way down the slope behind her with nothing but a length of rope, and a scavenged spear torn from a dead rider's hand. She took a shallow cut along her ribs from a rider who nearly gutted her before she put him down. She felt Reuben's back against hers at one desperate moment, the two of them fighting in the narrow gap between two standing stones where numbers could not overwhelm them both at once. His spear catching a blow meant for her spine, her axe answering for the opening he gave her. It should not have been survivable. 60 riders against 2 fighters and a handful of unarmed elders should have ended in slaughter, and it very nearly did. Ugak would carry the scar along her ribs for the rest of her life as proof of how close it came. But the avalanche had bought them the one thing an army needs more than numbers, which is time, and time enough for the moot ground's own guards, rallying at last from the shock of the initial ambush, to strike Gruk's divided force from the flank just as Ugak and Reuben struck from the rear, and between the 3 forces closing on him at once, Gruk Bonkleaver's carefully planned massacre collapsed into a rout. Ugak found him at last near the central standing stone, his black horse dead beneath him, his circlet, her father's circlet, still gleaming on his brow even as blood ran freely from a gash along his scalp. He turned as she approached, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 2 warriors who had trained together, raided together, and now stood on opposite sides of a truth 3 years buried. "You should have died on that road, Ironblood," Gruk snarled. "You should have died 3 years ago when you put a spear through my father's back," Ugak answered, and drew the iron torque from beneath her bodice, holding it up where the gathered elders, drawn by the sudden lull in fighting, could see it clearly in the smoke-hazed light. "This was found hidden in your own tent, Gruk Bonkleaver, wrapped and buried like a guilty man's secret. Every elder here knows my father's mark. Every elder here knows he did not lose it in the skirmish you claim killed him. You murdered your chieftain and lied to this clan for 3 years, and today you tried to murder the very council that might have finally called you to account for it." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of burning tents and the moan of the wounded. Gruk's eyes went from the torque to Ugak's face to the ring of elders now closing slowly, grimly around him. Men and women who had known Torger Ironblood for decades and had grieved his death without ever suspecting the shape of the lie that followed it. "Lies," Gruk spat, but there was no conviction left in it, only the desperate snarl of a cornered animal, and when Elder Ussa Stonecrow, oldest of the council and the only one among them who had been present the night Torger Ironblood's body was brought back from that long-ago skirmish, stepped forward and took the torque from Ugak's hand and turned it over in her weathered fingers, the silence that followed was even heavier than before. "I remember this torque," Ussa said slowly. "I remember it was not on Torger's body when it was returned to us. I remember you told us, Gruk Bonkleaver, that the enemy who killed him must have taken it as a trophy." She looked up and her ancient eyes were hard as flint. "You have just told this entire council, in front of 60 witnesses and the daughter of the man you murdered, that this same torque was found hidden in your own tent. There is no lie broad enough to cover that whole, Gruk. You have condemned yourself with your own mouth." What followed happened fast, the way such reckonings often do among a people who settle their laws with iron rather than argument. Gruk Bonkleaver, seeing the last of his loyal riders scattered or dead, and the full weight of clan law closing around him at last, made one desperate lunge for Ussa Stonecrow and the torque in her hand, and Ugak Ironblood, 3 years of grief and fury, finally given a target that law itself sanctioned, met him blade to blade in the center of the ancient standing stones, and the fight that had truly begun on a frozen road weeks before ended at last. In the way blood debts among her people had always ended, with her father's murderer falling beneath her father's daughter's axe before the eyes of the entire assembled clan. When it was over, Ugak stood breathing hard over Gruk's body, the circlet, her father's circlet, lying knocked loose in the churned snow, and looked up to find Reuben already limping toward her, a shallow spear graze along his forearm but otherwise whole, and the relief that broke across his face at the sight of her standing, alive, victorious, undid something in her chest more thoroughly than the fight itself had. Elder Ussa herself lifted the fallen circlet from the snow, and in front of the assembled clan, pressed it not onto her own brow, but into Ugak Ironblood's hands. "This belongs by right to Torger's blood," the old elder said, loud enough for every survivor of the massacre to hear. "The chieftainship of the Ashfang clan is yours to claim, Ugak Ironblood, if you would have it." Ugak looked down at the circlet, at the iron and the worn leather that had once rested on her father's brow, and felt the weight of every raid, every year of grief, every drop of blood spilled to bring the truth this far, settle at last into something like peace. Then she looked up, past the elder, past the ring of watching clan folk, to where Reuben Wells stood waiting at the edge of the firelight, patient as he had always been, asking nothing of her, offering everything, and she made her choice with the same certainty she had felt the moment she broke from the charge on that frozen road weeks ago. "I will not take the circlet, Elder Ussa," she said, and heard the murmur that ran through the gathered clan at her words. "My father did not die so that his daughter could sit in a chieftain's tent counting tribute. He died because a man's greed for a crown outweighed his honor. Let the council choose a chieftain who wants the burden for the clan's sake and not their own glory. I have another life waiting for me now, one I mean to claim instead." She walked to Reuben Wells across the churned, blood-marked snow of the moot ground, in full sight of every elder, every warrior, every soul who had witnessed both her father's justice and her own choice, and pressed the circlet not onto her own brow but into old Ussa Stonecrow's weathered hands instead. A final gift, a final release of a burden she had carried 3 long years, and then she turned to Reuben and did not care, for the first time in her life, who was watching. 3 days later, with Gruck's few surviving loyalists scattered or bound for judgment, and the moot ground's fires banked to embers, with the elders already deep in the slow, careful work of choosing a new chieftain and word already riding south, toward the human border towns that the threat of war which had been building for 3 years under Gruck Boncleaver's ambition had died with him on that field. Ugak Ironblood and Reuben Wells climbed together to a high, wind-scoured shoulder of the mountain. Far above the smoke and the grief and the politics of clan and council, to a place where the whole vast sweep of peaks and valleys lay spread beneath a sky gone impossibly clear and blue in the aftermath of the storm season, the first true break of spring sunlight catching on snowfields that stretched, unbroken and radiant, to every horizon. "You could have been chieftain," Reuben said quietly, standing beside her at the cliff's edge, the wind pulling at his hair at the collar of his coat. "You gave that up." "I gave up a crown I never wanted for a life I did," Ugak said, and turned to face him fully, the wind whipping loose strands of dark hair across her face, her eyes steady and warm and entirely certain in a way he had never seen them before, not even in the fiercest moment of battle. "I have spent 3 years carrying my father's justice like a stone in my chest, Reuben. I do not regret a moment of it, but it is done now. Gruck is dead, the truth is known. The war he wanted is buried with him. What remains is mine to choose, and I have already chosen." "And what have you chosen?" Reuben asked, though the answer was plain in every line of his face and the way he reached for her hands without hesitation, as he had learned to do so easily these past weeks, as though touching her had become as natural to him as breathing. "You," Ugak said simply. "I choose you, Reuben Wells. Not because you saved my life on that road, though you did, and not because you rigged an avalanche with nothing but rope and stubbornness to save a council full of strangers, though that too. I choose you because every single day since the shed, you have looked at me and seen a woman worth choosing, not a raider to fear or a curiosity to gawk at, but simply me. I have never in my life had that from anyone, orc or human, and I do not intend to spend another day of my life without it." Reuben's throat worked, and when he spoke, his voice had gone thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide from her. "I am a shipwright from a rough harbor town, Ugak. I have no crown to offer you, no clan, no great name. I have a small house near the yard and calloused hands, and a heart that has been half empty for longer than I care to admit, waiting, I think now, for exactly this. for you. That is more than any crown, Ugak said, and closed the last distance between them. And there, on that high, wind-scoured shoulder of the mountain with the whole clean world spread bright and endless beneath them, she claimed him in the old way of her people, the way reserved for a warrior who had found, at last, a mate worthy of standing beside her in battle and in peace both. She drew her small hunting knife, and before he could ask what she meant to do, she drew it lightly, deliberately across her own palm, and pressed the shallow cut to his lips, an ancient rite older than Gruk's ambition, older than the war between their two peoples, a claiming mark that bound a warrior's life to another's by blood and choice both, and Reuben Wells, understanding the weight of it even without knowing every word of the old tongue that accompanied it, pressed his mouth to her palm, and then, when she guided his own hand to mirror the gesture, let his blood mingle with hers in turn, sealing something between them that neither law nor distance, nor the long, hard history of their two peoples could unmake. Mine, Ugak said, low and fierce and utterly unguarded, the word carrying the whole weight of everything she had never dared claim before him. You are mine, Reuben Wells, as surely as I am yours, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you exactly how much that means. I already know exactly how much that means, Reuben said, and drew her into his arms beneath that vast, clear sky, and kissed her with all the passion of a man who had spent his whole quiet, ordinary life waiting, without knowing it, for a fierce, magnificent orc woman to run toward him instead of away, to choose him above every crown and every warband and every easier path the world might have offered her instead. They stayed on that mountain shoulder long into the golden hour before dusk, wrapped together against the last bite of the mountain wind, and what passed between them there, unhurried and tender and utterly theirs, needed no witness but the sky itself. A slow, warm claiming that answered every charged glance and stolen touch of the weeks behind them, every near miss and desperate battle, every quiet moment of trust built one careful choice at a time in a stone-way station, and a frozen cave, and a shepherd's lonely bothy. When at last the first stars began to prick through the deepening blue above the peaks, Ugak Ironblood lay with her head against Reuben Wells's chest, listening to the steady, sure beat of his heart, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and unshakably at peace. They did not return to Saltmere, not at first, though word did eventually reach the harbor town, carried by the same shepherd's family who had sheltered Mabel and Emric and the mending carter through the rest of that winter, that the timber contracts from Wingate had been settled after all, if somewhat unconventionally, by a shipwright who had gone missing on the mountain road and returned some weeks later with an orc woman at his side who wore, plain for anyone to see, the claiming mark of a warrior's chosen mate, and who was, whatever rumor and old prejudice might have made of such a pairing, so plainly and fiercely devoted to the quiet, steady man beside her that even the harbor towns, hardest gossips found in time less and less to say against it. The stone-way station where they had first learned to trust each other did not stand empty for long. It was Ugak's idea, offered one evening as they sat together before its old hearth some months later, the mountain roads open again, and the memory of that terrible, wonderful winter still fresh and precious between them, that a place built long ago for trade and shelter between two peoples who had once known peace before they knew war might serve that same purpose again, now that the threat Gruk Bonkleaver had nearly loosed upon the world lay buried with him. Reuben, who understood better than most the patient work of building something meant to last, agreed without hesitation, and set his shipwright's skills to raising a second floor and a proper stable, where once there had been only cobwebs and dust. They kept the way station together through that first full year and every year after, a lonely stone outpost between mountain and border town that slowly, steadily, became known on both sides of the pass as neutral ground once more, a place where orc traders and human merchants alike could rest a night in safety, where the woman who kept the hearth burning had once broken from a warband's charge for the sake of the man who kept the roof sound above it. And where? On quiet evenings when the trade road lay empty and the peaks outside glowed gold with the last light of day, Ugak Ironblood and Reuben Wells would climb together to that same high shoulder of mountain where they had first claimed each other, and stand hand in hand beneath the vast, unbroken sky, entirely and forever certain of the choice that had brought them there.